The morning Monroe Rourke rode into Salvation Creek, the sun was already burning a hole in the sky, and the dust rising from the main road had turned the whole town the color of old bone. He came in from the north, which told people something right away, because the North Road wound through Comanche territory and most men with good sense avoided it entirely. Monroe Rourke, it turned out, was not a man who went out of his way to use good sense, at least not in the conventional manner that the residents of Salvation Creek, Texas, understood the phrase. He used a different kind of sense, the kind that read the land, read the sky, read the silence between sounds. That kind had kept him alive for 28 years, and he saw no reason to abandon it now. He was a tall man, lean in the way that men who spent most of their lives outdoors tended to be lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck where his hat didn't reach, and brown eyes that held a warmth behind their steadiness that most people didn't notice until he'd been looking at them for a moment or two. His horse was a deep bay mare named Consequence, which he'd named himself at age 19 when he'd won her in a card game, and promptly realized that every decent thing in his life came attached to a reckoning of some kind. Salvation Creek was a proper town by 1878 standards. It had a general store, a telegraph office, a church with a bell that actually worked, 2 saloons, a hotel with 4 rooms, a blacksmith, a doctor who was only occasionally drunk, and a sheriff who was rarely sober but made up for it in sheer personal intimidation. There was a schoolhouse at the east end of the main road and a livery stable at the west end, and tucked between them was everything a person could need and most of what they wanted. Monroe tied Consequence at the rail outside the livery and stretched the road out of his back, rolling his shoulders until something popped satisfyingly. He needed work. He'd been drifting since leaving the McKinney ranch up in Colorado after an arrangement with the foreman had gone sour over a question of wages owed, and while drifting suited his temperament most of the time, his pockets had reached a state of thinness that required he do something about it before they gave out entirely. He heard her before he saw her. The voice came from around the side of the livery, low and firm, and carrying the particular tone of a person who was completely accustomed to being argued with and completely uninterested in losing. "I am telling you for the last time, Mr. Calder, that horse has a stone bruise, and if you ride her today, you will lame her for the season. Now you can do what you like because she is your animal, and the Lord gave you free will for reasons I have never personally understood, but you asked for my opinion and there it is." Monroe rounded the corner of the livery and found a young woman standing square in front of a middle-aged man twice her width, her arms crossed over the front of a leather apron, her dark red hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen considerable use. She was perhaps 22, 23 at the outside, with a face that was striking rather than conventionally pretty, all angles and expression, and something behind the eyes that suggested she was always thinking 3 things simultaneously and waiting for you to catch up. The man she was addressing, Mr. Calder presumably, was red in the face and opening and closing his mouth like a fish that had just discovered it was no longer in the water. "Now see here, Miss Bishop," he started. "I do see here," she said. "That is precisely the problem. Goodbye, Mr. Calder." She turned away from him with a finality that Monroe found genuinely impressive, and that was when she saw him standing there. She didn't startle, she just looked at him with those sharp, considering eyes and waited. "Morning," Monroe said. "It is," she agreed. "Are you looking to stable a horse?" "I am, and if there's work available I'm looking for that too." She studied him for a moment. Not the way women sometimes studied him, searching for something flattering to land on, but the way she'd probably studied Mr. Calder's horse, looking for what was actually there. "My father runs the livery," she said. "He's inside." "I'll tell him you're here." She paused. "What's your name?" "Monroe Rourke." "Ruby Bishop," she said, and extended her hand the way a man would, direct and businesslike, and he shook it. And that was the beginning of everything, though neither of them knew it yet. Walter Bishop was 61 years old, had one arm, and ran the finest livery stable in 4 counties with a combination of practical genius and absolute refusal to tolerate incompetence in any form. He had lost the arm at Gettysburg, which he mentioned exactly once to Monroe and never again, and had come west afterward because the East had too many memories attached to too many familiar corners. He'd built the livery himself, board by board, and raised Ruby in it after her mother passed when Ruby was 7, and the result was a daughter who knew horses the way most people knew breathing, without thinking about it much, just doing it completely, without error. Walter hired Monroe on the spot because Monroe's hands told the story his words didn't bother with. Rope calloused, careful, the hands of a man who'd spent years working with animals and hadn't developed the impatience that ruined so many cowboys when it came to the slow work of actual horsemanship. Room and board included, Walter said. There's a bunk in the back. Pay is $12 a month and I don't tolerate drinking on the property. I drink, Monroe said honestly. Off the property, Walter clarified. I don't tolerate it on. Fair enough. Ruby will show you what needs doing. Do what she tells you. Monroe looked at Ruby, who was leaning against the stall post with an expression that suggested she was fully prepared for him to have a problem with this arrangement. He didn't. He nodded at her and said, "Yes, sir," to Walter and picked up his saddle bags. That first week was a revelation. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because the ordinary rhythm of the livery was so far from what Monroe had known that it took him time to find the beat of it. The McKinney Ranch had been loud and rough, 60 men in constant movement, and the sense that the work was always slightly out of control. The Bishop livery had a different quality. It was busy, certainly. The town relied on it. Travelers stopped there. Horses were boarded and shod and treated and sold. But Ruby moved through all of it with a quiet command that kept everything ordered without making it feel rigid. She talked to the horses. Not baby talk, not the soothing nonsense some handlers used, but actual conversation, explaining things, narrating what she was doing. Monroe caught himself stopping work to listen more than once. She talks to them like they understand her, he mentioned to Walter one evening. Walter was mending a bridle by lamplight, his one hand remarkably dexterous with the awl. They do, he said simply. Most animals do. Most people don't bother to know what to say. Monroe thought about that for a long time. He learned the town piece by piece the way you learned any place, by being in it and paying attention. Salvation Creek had its layers. The cattle families who had money and knew it. The farming families who had less money and worked harder. The Mexican families on the south side of town, who had been there longer than anyone and were treated, Monroe observed with a familiar anger, as though they had arrived recently and without invitation. There was a Tonkawa man named Tomas who did leather work for the blacksmith, and whom most of the town treated as invisible, and whom Monroe made a point of greeting by name every morning, which earned him a slow nod of acknowledgment that felt like more than courtesy. The sheriff was a man named Hargrove, built like a wardrobe, with small eyes, and the habit of speaking to people in a way that reminded them he was armed. He visited the livery twice in Monroe's first week, both times to speak to Ruby, both times with a manner that Monroe couldn't quite categorize. Not threatening exactly, but not comfortable either. What's Hargrove's interest in this place? Monroe asked Ruby on the 8th day, when Hargrove had just ridden away after a conversation she'd clearly been relieved to end. Ruby was brushing out a chestnut gelding with long, smooth strokes that the horse was leaning into with the devotion of a man in a barber's chair. She didn't answer immediately. "He wants to buy the livery," she said at last. "He's been wanting to for 2 years. He thinks my father should retire." "He thinks I should," she stopped, chose different words. "He has ideas about what would be appropriate for a woman in my position." "What position is that?" "Unmarried, without property of my own." She said it flatly, the way you said things that were true and annoying in equal measure. "He's made it plain that if my father sold to him, he'd consider making that situation less precarious." Monroe understood what she was not quite saying. "Has he said that directly to your father?" He started to once. My father told him that Ruby makes her own choices, and that if he had something to say to me, he ought to say it to me. She smiled a little, sideways, not looking at Monroe. He didn't like that much. I imagine not. My father is not a conventional man in certain respects, she said, still with that small smile. It confuses people. Monroe found himself smiling too, looking down at the hay-strewn floor so she wouldn't see it. Your father seems like a sensible man to me. He is, she agreed. One of the very few. The weeks turned and Monroe settled into the work with the kind of ease that surprised him a little. He had never stayed anywhere long enough to feel settled. He'd been moving since he was 16, when his parents' small farm in Missouri had gone to debt, and his father had told him, with the quiet sorrow of a man who had no other options, that he couldn't feed him anymore. He'd worked cattle drives, mining camps, a stint as a scout for the army that he'd left when the nature of the army's business in that particular region had become impossible to stomach. He'd learned skills the way a man learned survival skills, completely and without sentiment. But Salvation Creek felt different, and after the third week he stopped asking himself why and acknowledged that the reason was almost certainly standing in the next stall, arguing with a gray stallion about whether it was going to accept a new bit. You are being ridiculous, Ruby informed the stallion, who tossed his head with considerable dignity. I understand your position. I don't agree with it. Open your mouth. The stallion, apparently unable to withstand the logic of her argument, opened his mouth. Monroe laughed, and Ruby turned and looked at him with an expression of total composure that only made him laugh harder. You find this amusing, she said. I find you remarkable, he said, and then stopped because he hadn't meant to say that out loud. It had been true in his head and had apparently decided to travel without asking permission. Ruby looked at him for a moment, the kind of moment that has weight to it. That's a kind thing to say, she said carefully. It's an honest thing to say, he said. I wouldn't have said it otherwise. She turned back to the stallion, but not before he saw the color move up her neck and into her face, and Monroe felt something click into place somewhere inside him that he hadn't realized had been loose. He started paying attention in a different way after that. Not in any manner he was particularly proud of, because it felt a little like watching someone when they weren't watching you, but he couldn't seem to stop. He noticed how she read in the evenings, sitting on an upturned crate near the lantern with a book propped on her knee, completely absorbed. He noticed how she handled difficult customers, with a patience that was real rather than performed, and how she never apologized for knowing more than they did about their own horses. He noticed how she cared for her father without fussing over him, and how Walter watched her sometimes with an expression of simple pride that was so unconcealed, it was almost startling. He noticed that she watched him too, when she thought he wasn't looking. The first time they had a real conversation, not about horses or the work or the town, was on a Sunday evening in late September when the heat had finally broken, and the air smelled like the rain that was probably coming from the west. They were both on the livery's front porch, Monroe sitting on the steps and Ruby on the old chair that Walter normally occupied, and the town was quiet in the particular way of Sunday evenings when the saloons were doing their business and everyone else had gone home. Where are you from originally? She asked. It was not a casual question when asked in 1878 in a western town. It was one of the primary sorting questions. Where are you from? What are you? Do you belong here or somewhere else? Missouri, he said. Farm country east of St. Joseph. He paused. Doesn't exist anymore. The bank made sure of that. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. He looked out at the street. You've always been here, born here. Before it was Salvation Creek, actually. It was just a trading post when my parents arrived. My father built 3 of the buildings on this street. She said this without particular pride, just fact. My mother is buried at the church. How old were you? 7. She said it the same way he'd said his farm didn't exist anymore. A long time ago. True, but not bleeding. Who taught you about horses? She smiled, and it changed her face the way light changed a landscape, made it suddenly luminous. My father, and a woman named Pillar whose family has ranched south of here for 4 generations. She knew things about horses that I am still working to understand. She paused. She also taught me to read in Spanish, which my father thought was an excellent idea and which Mr. Hargrove, when he discovered it, found deeply troubling. Monroe raised an eyebrow. He has strong opinions about what is and isn't appropriate knowledge for a woman, Ruby said, her voice careful and dry. He shares them freely. Does he give you trouble? She was quiet for a moment. He gives me the particular kind of trouble that men give women when they've decided they know better and they have authority backing them up. It's nothing extraordinary. It's just persistent. She looked at him. He suggested to my father that my opinions about horses and business have got me a reputation for being difficult. That sounds like the problem is with him, not your opinions. Yes, she said. It does, doesn't it? She said it without irony, but there was something in her eyes that was warm and quietly grateful, and Monroe felt it like a hand pressed briefly to his chest. October arrived, and with it, the serious business of the fall cattle drive through Salvation Creek, which brought 200 head and 30 cowboys, and all the attendant chaos that implied. Monroe worked 18-hour days for 2 weeks straight, and Ruby worked beside him without complaint, and they moved around each other in the close quarters of the packed livery with a naturalness that Monroe caught himself noticing, and then noticed that he was noticing, and felt a kind of sweet bewilderment about that whole process. One of the cattle drive cowboys, a red-faced man named Stokes, made a comment to Ruby on the 3rd day about whether a woman ought to be doing this kind of work, phrased in the particular way that was designed to sound like concern, but was actually something less generous. Monroe was across the stable and heard it, and he looked over at Ruby and waited to see what she would do, because he already knew she didn't need him to manage it for her. "Mr. Stokes," Ruby said pleasantly, "your horse has thrush in the left front hoof. I'm going to treat it for you. If you'd like to have an opinion about whether I'm capable of doing so, you're welcome to take him to the next livery, which is in Ridgeway, 40 miles east. Or you could let me do my job." Stokes shut his mouth. His horse got treated. Monroe laughed about it alone in the back that evening, and thought about how she was unlike anyone he'd ever met, and then thought about how much trouble that particular observation was going to cause him. The trouble came to a head on a Thursday in November, which began ordinarily enough and took a sharp left turn in the early afternoon, when Hargrove arrived with 2 men Monroe didn't recognize, and a piece of paper he wanted Walter to sign. Monroe was in the yard behind the livery when he heard Walter's voice, and the quality of it, not loud but tight, made him set down the water bucket and move toward the building. The paper, as far as Monroe could piece together from the conversation that was audible through the back door, was an offer to purchase the livery at a price that was approximately half what it was worth. The 2 men with Hargrove were, Hargrove explained, representatives of a land development interest out of Dallas that was expanding into this part of Texas and needed the livery's location for a freight depot. "I'm not selling," Walter said. "Mr. Bishop," Hargrove said in his most reasonable voice, "a man in your situation, my situation is that I own this property and I am not selling it. I'm trying to look out for your interests, and Ruby's. A young woman alone, Ruby is not alone," Walter said, "and Ruby's interests are Ruby's business." Monroe stepped inside. The 3 men turned at the sound of him. Hargrove's eyes moved over Monroe with the assessment of a man who was used to calculating how much trouble another man would be. "Monroe," Walter said, "these gentlemen were just leaving." "Were they?" Monroe said. It was not a question. Hargrove looked at Monroe for a long moment. "You're the new hand," he said. "That's right. I'd be careful about where you put yourself in other people's business." Monroe looked at him steadily. "I'd be careful about pressuring a man to sign something he doesn't want to sign." The quality of the silence in the room changed. One of the Dallas men shifted his weight. Hargrove held Monroe's gaze for 5 seconds, then looked back at Walter. "Think about it," he said. "The offer stands for 2 weeks. When they were gone, Walter let out a slow breath and sat down heavily on the stool behind the counter. Monroe waited. "He'll be back," Walter said. "I know. He wants this property because the freight line coming through next year will make it worth 4 times what he's offering." Walter rubbed the bridge of his nose with his one hand. "He's been patient, I'll give him that. Been patient for 2 years, but patient men run out of patience." "What do you want to do?" Walter looked at him. "Not sell," he said. "But that's easier said than maintained when the sheriff is the one applying pressure." Ruby appeared in the doorway from the back. Monroe realized she'd been there for some or all of it. Her face was composed, but her eyes were doing the thing where 3 thoughts ran through them simultaneously. "I heard," she said to her father. "I know you did. He's not going to stop." "No," Walter agreed. "Then we need to be smarter than he is," she said, "which shouldn't be too difficult because he's not as intelligent as he believes he is." Walter looked at his daughter for a moment and then laughed, the kind of laugh that came from deep in the chest, tired but real. "No," he agreed. "He's not." Monroe found himself watching Ruby and thinking that she was the most completely herself person he had ever encountered, and that this quality, so rare and so specific, was undoing him thoroughly. The smartness Ruby advocated for turned out to involve writing letters. She wrote to the land office in Austin, requesting documentation on the freight line proposal and whether Hargrove or his associates had filed any claims related to the livery property. She wrote to a lawyer in San Antonio whose name she'd gotten from Pillar's family, asking about their rights as property owners and what protections existed. She wrote to the newspaper in the next county, because newspapers liked stories about public officials and land grabs, and because Hargrove knew this and would know she'd done it. She did all of this at the kitchen table over 3 evenings, by lamplight, in her clear and exact handwriting. Monroe helped her draft the legal letter because he'd worked briefly for a land office in his travels and knew the terminology. They sat across the table from each other for 2 hours on the second evening, heads bent over the paper, and Monroe was very aware of how close she was and how the lamp made her hair the color of copper wire and how she smelled like hay and soap and something else, something warm, that he couldn't name. "I want to say something to you," he said, when they'd finished the letter. She looked up. The lamp was between them, and the light it cast made the moment feel like something out of a painting, amber and warm and a little unreal. "Then say it," she said. He looked at her. He was not a man who struggled for words, but he found himself choosing these ones carefully because they mattered in a way that other words had not. "I came to Salvation Creek looking for work," he said. "I've found more than that. I didn't expect to, and I didn't look for it, and I want to be honest with you about what it is." She was very still. "I think about you," he said, "more than I have any reasonable right to after 2 months' acquaintance. I think about what you say and what you know, and the way you move through the world like you've made a decision to take up exactly as much space as you need and not apologize for any of it." He paused. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that you matter to me. You've come to matter to me quite considerably, and I think you deserve to know that rather than have me carry it around in silence." Ruby looked at him across the lamp for a long moment. He couldn't read her face the way he normally could, which was unusual and slightly alarming. "Monroe," she said, and his name in her voice sounded like something he wanted to hear again. "Yes. I think about you too," she said. Not hurried, not shy, just direct. "I have been thinking about you for approximately 6 weeks, and finding it inconvenient because there is quite a lot of other thinking I need to do." He felt a smile breaking across his face and did nothing to stop it. "I understand the inconvenience completely. I don't know what you're looking for," she said carefully. "I don't know if you're a man who stays places or a man who leaves them. I've noticed you don't talk much about the future, and I want to know if that's because you don't think about it or because you've decided it doesn't exist." It was such a precise question that it took his breath away a little. He thought about his answer. "I've been a man who leaves," he said honestly. "I won't tell you otherwise. I've left more places than I've stayed, and mostly because I didn't have a reason to stay. I'm telling you that I think I've found a reason. I'm not a reason to stay," she said, and said it gently but firmly. "I'm a person. I don't want to be anyone's anchor. I've seen what that does to people, both the anchor and the ship." He nodded slowly, because she was right and he could see it. "Then let me say it differently. I've found a place where I want to be. The work is good and the people are good, and I would like to see what happens if I stop moving for a while." "You're part of why that feels possible." He met her eyes. "Is that better?" She thought about it. "That's better," she agreed. They stayed at the table for another hour after that, talking, and the conversation went in 10 directions and doubled back on itself, and wandered into territory that had nothing to do with legal letters. And Monroe thought he had never talked to anyone this freely, this easily, with this sense that whatever he said would be considered rather than judged, and that the consideration would be fair. December arrived, and the weather turned cold the way it did in that part of Texas. Not the killing cold of the north, but sharp enough to make the mornings hard and the evenings valuable. Monroe had been in Salvation Creek for 3 months, and Salvation Creek had become, in the way of all places that gradually become yours, simply home. He knew which board in the livery floor creaked. He knew that Walter drank his coffee with an alarming quantity of sugar, and that Ruby didn't drink coffee at all but had a ferocious devotion to tea that she'd inherited from a grandmother she'd never met. He knew that Tomas the leather worker played guitar in the evenings, and that the music traveled up the street on still nights, and that Ruby always paused when she heard it. He knew that she kept a journal. He knew this not because he'd seen it or asked about it, but because he'd noticed the way she disappeared for 20 minutes every morning, and came back with the particular settled quality of a person who has organized their thoughts into words. He also knew, by December, that he was completely and specifically in love with her, in the way that he understood was different from anything previous, because it did not make him feel constrained or obligated, but rather felt like the opposite of all those things. Like an opening rather than a closing. He spent considerable time thinking about what to do with this information. The Hargrove situation had not resolved itself neatly. The letters Ruby sent had done their work, at least partially. The Austin Land Office confirmed that no formal claims had been filed against the Bishop property, and the lawyer in San Antonio sent back a letter dense with encouraging language about property rights. Hargrove had backed off the immediate pressure, but he had not gone away, and the 2 Dallas men had been seen in town twice more, staying at the hotel and meeting with Hargrove at his office. There was also the question of the freight line itself, which, the Austin letter confirmed, was indeed planned and would pass through Salvation Creek in 1879. The property the freight company needed was adjacent to the livery, not the livery itself, which meant Hargrove's story about the depot needing their location was either a misunderstanding or a lie, and given everything else Monroe knew about Hargrove, he suspected the latter. Ruby took this information and filed it in the place where she filed things she intended to use later. "He's going to do something before spring," she told Monroe in early December. They were sitting in the livery's small office, which was barely big enough for the desk and 2 chairs, and the closeness of the space had stopped feeling awkward sometime around October and had settled into a familiarity that Monroe was aware of as a physical warmth. When the freight company formally announces the route, the land value goes up. He'll want to move before that happens. What does he want with a livery if it doesn't sit on the freight route? "Because the livery is where everyone comes," she said. "Horses, freight wagons, travelers. Control the livery and you control the information that moves through it. You know who's coming and going, what they're carrying, what they need." She looked at him levelly. "And because I won't be managed by him and he finds that personally offensive." Monroe had understood this about Hargrove for some time, but hearing her say it directly made the anger in him go cold and clear rather than hot, which was more useful. "We need to make sure the property documentation is airtight," he said. "It is," she said. "I've been making sure of that since last year." He looked at her. "You've been planning for this for a while." "I plan for everything," she said, without apology. He loved her so thoroughly in that moment that he nearly said so right out loud, and stopped himself only because the timing was terrible, and they were in the middle of a practical problem. What he did instead was take the documentation Ruby had assembled and ride to Ridgeway the following week, where there was a court recorder's office, and file copies of every relevant document in a separate jurisdiction so they couldn't be tampered with in Salvation Creek. It was a day's hard riding each way, and he came back cold and saddle-sore and found Ruby waiting for him with hot food and the expression of someone who had been more worried than they intended to admit. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him for a moment, and there was something in her expression that was softer than anything she usually showed, opened up in a way that was different from her normal steadiness. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You're welcome," he said, equally quiet. They stood there in the kitchen doorway for a moment that stretched out in a way that moments sometimes do, when both people in them know something is about to happen but neither of them has quite moved yet. And then Walter called from the sitting room asking whether Monroe wanted coffee or something stronger after that ride, and the moment ended, and they both breathed. Christmas came to Salvation Creek with a church service, and a tree in the hotel lobby, and someone's children caroling in the street with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Ruby and Walter had a modest celebration that Monroe was included in without ceremony, as though it had been decided without anyone mentioning it that he was part of the household. Walter produced a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving since October. Ruby made a pie with dried apples and spices that Monroe thought was probably the best thing he'd ever eaten and said so. And she told him that flattery was transparent, and she would tell him the recipe anyway because it was not complicated. He gave her a book. He'd ordered it from the general store 3 weeks earlier after overhearing her tell Walter she'd read everything on the shelf twice, a collection of essays by a woman he'd heard she admired, and he'd worried it was too personal a gift and then decided he didn't care. She held it in both hands and looked at the cover for a long moment. "Monroe," she said. "Merry Christmas, Ruby." She looked up at him and the softness was back, full and unguarded. "Thank you," she said, and this thank you carried more in it than the last one, was weighted with something that pressed warm against his ribs. She gave him a pair of riding gloves she'd made herself. The leather worked soft and fitted to a hand she'd measured against the outline of one of his old ones she'd found in the stable. They fit perfectly. He kept them for the rest of his life. The new year arrived, 1879, with a cold, clear sky and the freight company announcement in the second week of January, and everything in Salvation Creek shifted the way things shift when money starts moving. The announcement confirmed the route and confirmed the land acquisitions needed, and the land list, which was published in the county paper, did not include the Bishop livery. Hargrove was at the livery on the morning the paper arrived. He had clearly read it, and he was not in a good temper about what it said. Ruby was behind the counter when he walked in. Walter was in the back. Monroe was in the yard and heard the bell above the door, and something in his gut told him to come inside, which he did quietly, standing in the doorway from the back that Hargrove wasn't watching. "The freight company list doesn't include your property," Hargrove said to Ruby. He was keeping his voice level, which made it somehow worse. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't, you knew that. I had documentation suggesting it, yes." Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. "I made a fair offer." "You made a fraudulent offer based on claims that weren't true," she said pleasantly, "about which I have written records in 2 jurisdictions." The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly. "You are a difficult woman," Hargrove said. "I have been told," she agreed. "I've decided it's a compliment. I'm the law in this county, Miss Bishop. I'd encourage you to remember that." "I remember it every day," she said. "I also remember that the law is not the same thing as you personally, and that the distinction matters." Monroe stepped fully into the room. Hargrove turned and saw him. Something moved across the sheriff's face, calculation, and then the calculation resolved into a retreat, not an admission of defeat but a tactical withdrawal of the particular kind that meant he was not done. "Good day, Miss Bishop," Hargrove said, and left. Ruby exhaled slowly after the door closed. She looked at Monroe. That was either the end of it or the beginning of the next part, she said. The next part, Monroe said. Yes, she agreed. I think so too. The next part arrived in February in the form of two events that were separate but connected. The first was that the freight company sent a representative to Salvation Creek to finalize agreements with landowners. And this representative, a neat man from Dallas named Aldrich, stopped at the livery because his horse had thrown a shoe outside of town and needed attention. Ruby gave his horse attention and gave Aldrich coffee, and they had a conversation. And by the end of it, Aldrich had expressed a strong interest in a business agreement that would make the Bishop livery the official horse care station for freight company travelers passing through, which would more than double their income, and which would also, Ruby understood and did not say out loud, make the property so firmly embedded in legitimate commercial infrastructure that any attempt to pressure them out would become considerably more complicated legally and politically. She shook Aldrich's hand and wrote Walter the details, and then sat down at the kitchen table and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of pure triumph before standing back up and going to work. The second event was that Hargrove tried something stupid. He sent his deputy, a young man named Cruz, who Monroe privately thought was not a bad person, but who had made the significant life error of signing on to work for Hargrove, to the livery with a health and safety citation. The citation claimed the livery was in violation of fire codes, which would require an inspection and possible temporary closure. Monroe read the citation and said, "This is not a real citation." "It's got the county seal," Cruz said uncomfortably. "The County Health and Safety Code for liveries references a statute that was repealed in 1875, Monroe said. "I looked it up when I filed the property documents in Ridgeway because I wanted to understand the regulatory environment. If you file this, the county recorder in Ridgeway will note the error and it will reflect badly on whoever issued it." He paused. "I'm not saying this to make trouble for you, Cruz. I'm saying you should think about whose instructions you're following and what happens when they don't work out." Cruz looked at him, looked at the citation, took it back. He resigned his position 3 weeks later and took a job at the freight company depot, which was being built on the land adjacent to the Bishop livery, and which, Monroe noted, meant he saw Cruz regularly, and they had a reasonably decent working relationship going forward. Hargrove did not take the freight company loss with grace. He lost the election for sheriff in March, which Monroe suspected was partly the result of the letter Ruby had sent to the county newspaper the previous November, and the subsequent interest the paper had taken in Hargrove's use of his office. The new sheriff was a woman named Clara Hadley, which caused considerable conversation in Salvation Creek, and which Ruby greeted with quiet satisfaction. Without his office, Hargrove had less leverage. He still owned property in town, and he still had money, and he still had bad temper and wounded pride, but he no longer had the particular power that had made him dangerous, and the Dallas men stopped coming to Salvation Creek shortly after the sheriff election. Monroe sat on the front porch of the livery on the evening of Clara Hadley's first official day in office and felt the specific satisfaction of something being set right, however imperfectly. Ruby came and sat beside him. She had her tea. The evening was mild for March, the first hint of warmth at the edge of the air. "Your letters did that," Monroe said. "Our letters," she said. "You wrote half of them. I wrote the legal language, you wrote the heart of it." She looked at him sideways with a small smile. "Do you know what my father said this morning?" "What did he say?" "He said that Monroe Rourke is the best hand I've ever hired, and I intend to make him a partner if he's agreeable." She paused, watching his face. "He means in the business." Monroe looked at her. "What do you mean?" The color was in her face again, the way it had been that day in the stable when he'd called her remarkable, but she held his gaze steadily. "I mean he said what he said. He also said other things. About the fact that you've been here 6 months and you haven't left, and that you look at me the way his brother looked at the woman he married." She stopped, took a breath. I'm telling you this because you were honest with me in December, and I think I owe you honesty in return." Monroe set down his coffee cup very carefully on the porch rail. "Ruby," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for quite some time. I didn't want to say it before because you told me you didn't want to be a reason, and I was still figuring out how to say it so it didn't sound like that." He looked at her, at the lamp-warm face and the sharp eyes, and the copper hair coming loose from its pins the way it always did by evening. "What I want to say is that I love you because of who you are, entirely and specifically, not because you are something I need. I've stopped needing things to anchor me. I want to stay here because this is where I want to be, and part of what makes it where I want to be is you. But you are not a reason. You are the person I want to be beside while I'm here, if you'll have me." She had set down her teacup. She was looking at him with the fullness of her expression that she usually kept partially in reserve. "Monroe Rourke," she said slowly, "that is possibly the best thing anyone has ever said to me. I mean every word of it." "I know you do," she said. "That's what makes it the best thing." She was close. The porch was narrow and they had always sat close on it, the way people sat close when the porch was narrow, but this was different. This was the closeness of two people who had been moving toward each other for 6 months and had arrived. He reached out and took her hand carefully. The way you reached for something you understood was valuable. She let him. They sat there on the porch holding hands while the town moved around them, lamplights coming on in windows, someone's dog barking 2 streets over, the distant drift of Tomas's guitar from wherever he was playing tonight. And Monroe thought that this was what it felt like to be exactly where you were supposed to be. He kissed her that evening when they were both standing, not sitting, and she had turned to go inside, and he had caught her hand and she had turned back. It was not a tentative kiss. Neither of them were tentative people. It was warm and sure, and it lasted long enough to mean something. And when they stepped apart, she looked at him with those clear eyes and said, "Good," as though something had been confirmed. "Good," he repeated. "Good," she said again, and went inside, and he stood on the porch for another 10 minutes in the pleasant bewilderment of a man whose world has just rearranged itself into a better shape. Spring arrived, and with it the freight depot going up on the adjacent lot, and the Bishop Livery's new contract with the freight company, and Monroe officially becoming what Walter called a partner, and what Monroe understood was something more significant than the word suggested. Walter was 61 and not in poor health but not robust either, and the understanding between the three of them, unspoken but clear, was that Monroe was taking on a future here. He understood this and welcomed it without reservation. He and Ruby moved through their days with the ease of two people who had understood each other almost from the beginning and had simply needed time to admit it. They argued sometimes, because they were both people with opinions and neither of them was inclined to yield one without good reason. And the arguments were real arguments, and sometimes they were loud. And once the chestnut gelding was so alarmed by a particularly energetic disagreement about the shoeing schedule that he kicked his stall door. But they always resolved, and what was on the other side of resolution was always closer than what had been there before. Walter watched this with a contentment he showed in small ways, an extra cup of coffee poured without being asked, a comment made in passing that landed softly, the way he said good night with the ease of a man who had stopped worrying. April was when Monroe made the decision he'd been circling around since December. He made it not impulsively but thoughtfully over the course of a week, examining it from different angles the way he examined most important things, looking for the places where it might be wrong or premature or based on something other than what he thought it was based on. He found none of those things. What he found instead was a bedrock certainty of a kind he'd never experienced before, quiet and complete and not requiring any validation. He had a ring made by the jeweler in Ridgeway, who was actually a watchmaker who did jewelry on the side, and whose work was careful and beautiful. It was a simple band of silver with a small turquoise stone, because he'd seen Ruby admire a brooch with turquoise that Pillar wore, and because he wanted the ring to reflect her, not a general idea of a ring. He carried it in his vest pocket for 3 days before he did anything with it, because he was working out the right order of events. Then he went to Walter. It was an evening in late April, after supper, with Ruby gone to Pillar's family to help with a foaling mare that was having trouble. Walter was in the sitting room with his pipe and a book, the lamplight making the room gold and warm. Monroe sat down across from him. Walter looked up from his book with the expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation for some time, and had prepared himself for it in the way of someone who reads broadly and thinks carefully. "I'd like to speak with you," Monroe said. "I know," Walter said. Monroe looked at him. "I want to ask for your blessing on asking Ruby to marry me." He said it directly because he was a direct man, and because Walter was a direct man, and everything between them had always been direct. Walter set down his book. He looked at Monroe for a long moment, and there was something in his face, love for his daughter and assessment of this man before him, and the weight of a father's particular knowledge that time is moving, and the people you love are moving with it. "Monroe," Walter said, "I'm going to tell you something that I told Sheriff Hargrove when he came around making implications, and that I've told every man who has ever thought he needed my permission to speak to my daughter." He paused. "Ruby makes that choice herself." Monroe held his gaze. "I will say this," Walter continued. "I am not opposed to you. I am not opposed to you in any way, not your character, not your prospects, not the kind of man you are, because I know the kind of man you are and I respect it deeply." He picked up his pipe. "But the only opinion that matters on this question is hers. You are not asking the right person." Monroe thought about this for a moment. Then he nodded. "You're right," he said. "I know you are. I asked you because I respect you, and I wanted you to know my intentions, not because I thought you were the one who had to give permission." Walter looked at him, and the expression on his face was something Monroe would remember for the rest of his life. Pride. Not paternal pride exactly, but the pride of a person who has maintained a principle for years and watched it prove itself right in this moment. "Then you know what you need to do," Walter said. "Yes," Monroe said. He rode out to Pillar's ranch in the dark, because the foaling would keep Ruby there until late, and he didn't want to wait, which was perhaps not the most patient approach to a proposal, but which felt right, felt like urgency born of certainty rather than impatience. He arrived at the ranch house to find the foaling done and Ruby in the paddock standing with Pillar, both of them watching the new foal try its legs in the lamplight from the barn. It was a bay, still damp, all wobbling knees and enormous eyes, and it was beautiful in the specific way of newborn things that are also miraculous. Pillar saw Monroe coming through the gate and looked at him, and then looked at Ruby, and then walked toward the barn with the considered timing of a person who understood exactly what was happening. Ruby turned when she heard him, and her face was open with the joy of the foaling, still warm with it, and she said, "It's a boy." "He's perfect, Monroe, you should have been here." And then she stopped because she could see his face. "What is it?" she said, not alarmed but alert. He came and stood in front of her in the paddock with the mare moving quietly behind Ruby and the new foal picking up his feet experimentally and the lamp throwing shadows long and warm across the April dark. "I want to talk to your father," he said. She looked at him carefully. "I asked for his blessing." She waited. "He told me that Ruby makes that choice herself." Something moved across her face, love for her father and recognition, and something that looked like the beginning of tears, though she held them back with the composure he'd come to know as entirely her own. "He said that, did he?" she said quietly. "He did." Monroe reached into his vest pocket. "He was right. This is a question I should be asking you." He held the ring in his palm, and it caught the lamplight, the silver and the turquoise, and he looked at her and didn't try to make it into a speech, because she didn't need a speech and he didn't have more words than these. "I love you," he said. "I want to spend my life with you. I want to build something with you that neither of us could build alone, and I want to be beside you when things are hard and when they're good and in all the ordinary days between. I am asking, Ruby Bishop, if you will marry me. And I want you to know that your answer, whatever it is the only answer that matters." Ruby looked at him for a long moment. The foal made a small sound behind her and the mare answered it softly, and somewhere in the dark beyond the paddock fence a nighthawk was calling, and the night air smelled like spring grass and new life. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes, Monroe Rourke." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it in the lamplight for a moment, touching the turquoise stone with her other hand. And then she looked up at him, and he kissed her in the middle of the paddock with the new foal watching them both with enormous blank curiosity. And Pillar, from the barn doorway, began to applaud slowly. They rode back to Salvation Creek together in the April dark, and Ruby held his hand on the road, which was something she'd never done on horseback before, and Consequence and Ruby's gray, whose name was Mathematics for reasons Ruby had never fully explained, moved companionably side by side as though they'd always been a pair. Walter was still in the sitting room when they got back, very determinedly still reading his book and not appearing to have been waiting, which Monroe thought was one of the kindest performances he'd ever witnessed. Ruby went to her father and hugged him, her arms around his shoulders, and Walter put his one arm around her and held on for a moment. "Papa," she said. "I know," he said. "I know." Monroe stood in the doorway of the sitting room and watched a father and his daughter hold each other, and felt something in his chest that was not quite sadness and not quite joy, but was the specific feeling of being present at something true. They were married in June. It was the kind of wedding that fit the people having it, which meant it was honest and warm, and had a reception that went until well past midnight and involved music from Tomas, who played guitar beautifully and had added a fiddle player from the farming community south of town, and food that Pillar's family had contributed in quantities that suggested they had decided to feed the entire county, which was not far from accurate. Ruby wore a dress that had belonged to her mother, deep blue wool with cream lace at the collar, let out and altered by Pillar's eldest daughter, who was a seamstress of considerable talent. She wore her hair up, with copper pins that caught the June light. Monroe wore his best clothes, which were not remarkable, and Ruby had told him the week before that she didn't care what he wore as long as he showed up, which he thought was an excellent principle for a wedding. The ceremony was performed by the minister at Salvation Creek's church, a practical man who understood his congregation and kept the vows to what mattered and out of what didn't. Monroe said his vows looking at Ruby and meant every word and saw in her eyes that she knew it, and she said hers in the clear, certain voice of a woman who never said things she didn't mean and was not going to start now. Walter sat in the front pew beside Pillar and cried without apology. Clara Hadley, the new sheriff, attended and made a toast at the reception that was direct and warm and made everyone laugh. The freight company's man Aldrich was there too, because Ruby had invited him on the logic that business relationships became more durable when people knew each other as human beings. Monroe danced with Ruby 3 times and would have danced every dance with her, but she told him he had to be sociable and danced with Tomas, and then with Aldrich, and then with her father, who moved with the careful dignity of a man who had figured out how to do most things with one arm and had not made peace with not doing them, but had made something better than peace, which was determination. Late in the evening, when the dancing had wound down and people were drifting home and the lanterns were burning low, Monroe and Ruby stood together on the hotel's back porch, which looked out over the dark prairie. The stars were extraordinary the way they always were out here, enormous and countless. "Mrs. Rourke," Monroe said. "Don't you start," she said, but she was smiling with her whole face. "I'm going to say it every day. I'll warn you now that it will stop having the desired effect within a week." "We'll see," he said. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they stood there looking at the Texas sky, and Monroe thought that he had traveled a very long way to arrive at exactly here, and that the distance had been worth every inch of it. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not without difficulty, but without emptiness. The freight depot brought more travelers through Salvation Creek, and the Bishop livery prospered, and Monroe's partnership with Walter became, as Walter's health gradually required more rest and less heavy work, the primary management. Monroe had a knack for the business side that surprised him, though it surprised Ruby less. "You've always been organized," she told him. "You just thought you weren't because you confused organization with stillness. You can be organized and still moving." He wrote that down in the margin of his account book and looked at it sometimes. Walter died in the autumn of 1881, peacefully, in his own bed, with Ruby beside him and Monroe standing in the doorway of the room. He had been ill for 6 weeks and had faced it with the directness that had characterized everything else in his life. He told Ruby what he needed to tell her, which apparently took most of one afternoon, and he told Monroe on a separate afternoon that he was a better man than he sometimes gave himself credit for, and that Walter had known from the moment he saw Monroe's hands that he was the right person. "My hands," Monroe said. "A man's hands tell you everything," Walter said. "Yours told me you were patient and careful and that you'd learn to work with things rather than against them." He paused. "And you were kind to Tomas. That told me everything else." Monroe carried that with him. They buried Walter at the church beside his wife, and Ruby stood at the grave in the October cold with a composure that was real rather than performed, and Monroe stood beside her and held her hand, and afterward he held her while she cried, fully and deeply, the way she'd never cried in front of him before. He said nothing because there was nothing to say, and she needed nothing from him except exactly what he was doing. Life continued, because it does. Their first child was born in March of 1882, and he was a boy they named Walter Monroe Rourke, which was so obviously right that they had agreed on it before the child was 5 minutes old. He came into the world at full volume and spent the first months of his life under the impression that the appropriate response to any situation was to see what happened if he yelled about it, which Ruby handled with the same patience she handled difficult horses and Monroe handled by taking long walks around the livery yard. "He's going to be trouble," Monroe told Ruby one morning when the baby had finally fallen asleep and they were both leaning on opposite sides of the kitchen doorframe in the state of exhaustion particular to new parents. "He's going to be interesting," Ruby corrected. "Trouble is trouble. Interesting is the same energy put to better use." Monroe looked at her. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known." "You've told me that," she said, "the first week in the stable. It's still true." "It is," she agreed, without false modesty, and pushed off the doorframe to start breakfast. And Monroe watched her move around the kitchen in the morning light and felt the same thing he'd felt on that April porch and in the church in June, and on every ordinary morning between. The specific quality of a happiness so settled it had become simply the nature of things. Pillar's family became, in the years that followed, something close to family by design rather than biology. Her eldest daughter, Maria, was Ruby's closest friend and the godmother of young Walter, and the connection between the Bishop livery and the Pillar ranch deepened into a genuine partnership as the freight business grew and horses became an increasingly commercial matter. Monroe made a point, in the running of the livery, of the thing Ruby had always done, which was to treat everyone who came through the door as a person of equal standing. He was not naive about the injustices that ran through the world around him like fault lines, the way Mexican families were systematically disadvantaged in land dealings, the way Tomas and others like him existed in a town that benefited from their work while pretending they were barely there. He could not fix these things by being fair within his own 4 walls, but he believed, as Ruby did, that it mattered anyway, that the accumulation of small dignities was not nothing. Tomas, who made beautiful leather goods and whom most of the town passed without seeing, was paid fairly for his work at the livery and greeted by name and invited to the wedding and played guitar at the reception. And when he died in 1884, Monroe and Ruby were among the very few non-Tonkawa people at his funeral, and they stood there in the autumn cold, because you showed up for people you respected. Their second child came in 1885, a girl they named Clara, after the sheriff, who had become a genuine friend over the years, and who received the honor with the characteristic directness of a woman who made direct the governing principle of all interactions. Clara Hadley, the person, appeared at their door with a bottle of wine and the expression of someone who was very pleased and intended to show it briefly before returning to the business of being sheriff. Clara Rourke, the child, was her brother's perfect foil, quiet where he was loud, still where he was always moving, with her mother's sharp eyes and her father's brown warmth, a combination that Monroe suspected would be formidable in about 15 years. The livery grew. Monroe added a second building in 1883 to handle the increased volume from the freight line, and hired 2 additional hands, a young man named Eli from the farming community, and a woman named Paz, Pillar's niece, who had grown up with horses the way Ruby had, and who turned out to be even better with the difficult cases, the traumatized animals, the ones that had been mishandled and needed patient rebuilding. Ruby oversaw all of it with the quality Monroe had admired from the first week, the quiet command that ordered without rigidity, that led by knowing more than anyone else and not being precious about sharing the knowledge. She also finished the journal she'd been keeping since before Monroe arrived, filled 3 more, and started a 4th. He never asked to read them and she never offered. It was her own interior world, and he respected that boundary as he'd respected all her boundaries, completely and without resentment, because the woman who chose to share her life with him was more than he'd ever hoped for, and asking for her interior world on top of that would have been the kind of greed that spoiled good things. She read to the children in the evenings, the way she'd been read to, from whatever books she had. Young Walter sat through stories with the focused intensity of a child who was already stubborn about learning things, and Clara fell asleep during them reliably, which Ruby found charming rather than disappointing. Monroe built them a proper house adjacent to the livery in 1886, because the rooms above the original livery building were fine but not large enough for 4 people, and Ruby had expressed, once mildly, that she would like a garden, and he took mild expressions from her seriously because she used them rarely. The garden happened. She grew herbs and vegetables, and a rose that she'd gotten as a cutting from Pillar, and which took 2 years to decide to bloom, and then bloomed every summer with a stubbornness that Ruby found, Monroe thought, personally validating. Salvation Creek changed through the 80s, the way all frontier towns changed as the frontier became less wild and more complicated, more connected to the east by rail and telegraph, more subject to pressures from money and politics that came from elsewhere. The cattle trade shifted. The freight business grew and then specialized. New families arrived and old ones moved away, and the town got a second doctor and a third saloon, and a school that Ruby served on the board of, which she'd been invited to join in 1884, and which she'd accepted on the condition that the board would consider curriculum that included history beyond what the standard Eastern textbooks contained. There were debates about this. Ruby had debates cheerfully. Monroe sat at school board meetings sometimes in the back row and watched his wife in the full exercise of her capabilities, and felt the same pride he always felt, specific and deep and clean. Hargrove, for those keeping track, had left Salvation Creek in 1880 and gone to Dallas, where he apparently found the larger city's commerce more amenable to his particular style of operation. Monroe heard occasionally through business contacts that he was doing well, which he took with equanimity. Some men escaped consequences, and some didn't, and you couldn't spend your life tracking which category everyone fell into. Clara Hadley served as sheriff until 1889, when she retired with considerable ceremony and a community supper that Monroe and Ruby attended, and at which Ruby gave the longest speech Monroe had ever heard from her in public, 12 full minutes of genuine tribute that made Clara Hadley, who was not a person who cried, come very close. On an evening in September of 1890, Monroe sat on the front porch of the house he'd built, and Ruby sat beside him in the chair that had migrated from the livery when the house was finished, the chair that had been Walter's, and before that no one could quite remember. Their children were inside, young Walter doing mathematics with the focused aggression of a boy who had decided to be good at things he found difficult, and Clara reading by the lamp with the absolute stillness of a child who had inherited her mother's complete absorption. Ruby had her tea. Monroe had his coffee. The evening air was September mild, and the town around them was doing its quiet evening business, lamplight in windows and distant sounds, and the sense of a place that had settled into itself. "Do you know what today is?" Ruby asked. Monroe thought. "Tuesday. 12 years since you rode into Salvation Creek." He looked at her. She was 42 this year, her red hair threaded through with silver at the temples that she wore with complete indifference to what anyone thought about it, her face a map of a life lived outdoors and thoughtfully, and he found her more beautiful than he had found her at 22 in a leather apron arguing with a customer about his horse's stone bruise. "I came in from the North Road," he said. "I remember. People talked about that." "Did they?" "They said any man who came in from the north either knew what he was doing or was an idiot." She looked at him sideways. "The jury was out for a while. Which way did it go?" She smiled, and it still did what it had always done, made her face entirely luminous. "Unanimous," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way he'd first done on that October evening on the narrow porch of the old livery, and she held it the way she always had, firmly, without performance, just fact. "I would come in from the North Road again," he said. "Every time," she said. "Every single time." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was not something she did often, and he felt the weight of it like a gift. "I have been thinking," she said. "Tell me. I think we should put Paz in as head of operations at the livery. She is better at it than either of us in most respects, and I would like to spend more time on the school board and less time on the scheduling." Monroe thought about this. Paz was 29, brilliant with animals, methodical with the business side, and had earned the respect of every person who worked there. "I think that's exactly right," he said. "I thought you'd say that. You usually know what I'll say." "Usually," she agreed. "You surprise me occasionally. I appreciate it when you do." "I'll make a note," he said, "to be more unpredictable." She laughed low and real, the laugh that was entirely private, that she didn't perform for anyone. Inside the house, they could hear young Walter apparently explaining something to his sister with considerable passion, and Clara responding in the patient monotone of a younger sibling who has heard this kind of explanation many times and is waiting for it to be over. "Walter is going to want to go away to school," Ruby said. "He's mentioned it 4 times in the last month." "He has," Monroe agreed. "What do you think?" "I think he should go," she said simply. "He's ready, and it would be good for him, and the world is larger than Salvation Creek." She paused. "He should know that he can go and come back, that this is still home. We'll tell him that. We will." She was quiet for a moment. "I never wanted to leave. I've always been exactly where I wanted to be." She said it without judgment of anyone who wanted differently, just as observation. "I think that's rare." "It is," Monroe said. "It's very rare." "Are you where you want to be?" she asked. He looked at the town street, at the lights in the windows of the livery down the road, at the freight depot, at the church where they'd married and where Walter Bishop was buried, at the house they'd built, at the garden that was dark now but would be there in the morning. "Ruby," he said. "Monroe," she said. "I am exactly where I want to be." She held his hand a little more firmly, just briefly, and then settled back against him, and they sat there on the porch in the September evening, while their children argued mildly inside and the town went quiet around them. And Monroe Rourke thought about the North Road and consequence, and a woman in a leather apron who had shaken his hand like a man, and not apologized for knowing more than he did. And he thought about a father who had looked him straight in the eye and said the truest thing Monroe had ever heard from anyone. "She makes that choice herself." And she had. She had made every choice herself, with the full force of who she was, and she had chosen this life and chosen him within it. And the choosing had been real and deliberate and unwavering. And that made everything, the livery and the house and the children and the 12 years and everything that would come after, more than it would have been under any other circumstances. It made it true. Young Walter came to the doorway and said there was a question about the mathematics he couldn't work out, and could his father look at it. And Monroe got up and went inside and sat at the kitchen table with his son, and worked through the problem. And Ruby stayed on the porch with her tea and the September dark for a little while longer. Clara came and climbed into her mother's lap, too old for this really but doing it anyway, and Ruby put her arms around her daughter without comment, and they sat together watching the street. "Mama," Clara said, "what is it, sweetheart? Are you happy?" Ruby looked at the lamplight in the livery windows and the rose that she could see in the garden even in the dark, a pale shape against the fence. She thought about her mother's dress and her father's sitting room and a turquoise ring and an April paddock, and a new foal's enormous eyes and 12 years of ordinary, extraordinary days. "Yes," she said, "I really am." Inside, Monroe had solved the mathematics, and Walter was copying the answer with the focused intensity of a boy who had decided to understand why rather than just what. And Monroe was explaining the why in the patient, specific way of a man who had been taught, by the woman on the porch and by all the years between the North Road and this kitchen table, that the work of understanding was always worth the effort. The lamplight made the kitchen gold. The porch was silver with moonlight. The livery stood at the end of the road the way it had always stood, boards and hardware and the smell of horses and leather. The thing Walter Bishop had built plank by plank and left to people who would tend it the way he had tended it, with all of themselves. Paz would take it over in the spring, and it would be good in her hands, the way good things were good in good hands. And Ruby would sit on the school board and argue for history that told the truth, and Monroe would ride Consequence's daughter, a mare he'd named Reckoning, because he was sentimental about naming patterns, on the North Road sometimes just because he could. And the town would go on, and the children would grow, and Walter would go away to school and come back changed and more himself at once, and Clara would grow into the exact formidable person Monroe had predicted and become a lawyer in a world that was slowly, imperfectly, unevenly making room for that. And Paz would run the livery for 20 years with a competence so complete that people forgot there had been anyone else. And on autumn evenings, Monroe and Ruby would sit on the porch with coffee and tea and hold hands and watch their town go quiet. Two people who had found each other on a September morning in 1878, one of them looking for work, and one of them arguing with a man about his horse, and had built everything from that. From a handshake and a question about where a person came from, and 2 months of circling before December, and the lamp between them and the ring in the paddock and the June wedding, and all the ordinary days that were also extraordinary if you paid attention, which they both did. Always.